So to begin with, I would request Professor Philip Goldberg to speak on the topic that he has selected, the enduring impact of Swami Vivekananda on America's consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you, Swamiji. I am deeply honored to have been invited here. I hold this lineage of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda line in great esteem and affection, and hold it with great gratitude for the effect it's had on my life and on millions of people. And I hope you will agree by the time I finish speaking that the whole country should be grateful for this lineage. And I'm especially honored to be invited to this occasion on a day when America celebrates its fallen war heroes, to be paying tribute to a spiritual warrior of great skill and impact. It's my conviction, and the reason I wrote American Veda, that the transmission from India to America, to the West in general, of India's eternal and great spiritual heritage, mostly in the form of Vedanta and yoga, is one of the most important developments in our history of the last 200 years, and especially the last 100. And I think certainly when it comes to the spiritual history of the country, it could be the most important development. It has had a deep and powerful impact on the religious and spiritual landscape of America. And it's a much more subtle impact than people realize. And I tried to document in my book, but I think over time it will become more and more evident. I have come to think of America as a nation of yogis and Vedantas, even if they don't know it. And if you look at the data, and I won't bore you too much with data, but if you look at the data over the last, especially 30, 40 years of America's spiritual attitudes and their approach to how they pursue the spiritual impulse, you'll recognize that what I say has some validity, because there are yogis in churches and synagogues and mosques and non-religious settings who don't think of themselves as yogis, certainly not as Vedantas. They may never have heard the word Vedanta. But the way they see the world, the way they understand who they are and their relation to the larger universe of spirit is Vedantic. And in their approach to their own spirituality is very yogic. They understand the oneness that Swamiji referred to. They recognize they are not separate and apart from what we call ultimate reality or spirit. And they seek in their spiritual lives to realize that oneness. They also recognize to a larger extent than people acknowledge, that there is no one religion that is supreme, despite other impulses in American life that would have you think that. And the eternal truth of that there is one truth, that the wise call it by many names. They may never have heard that expression or its Sanskrit equivalent, but they acknowledge that. They recognize there are many paths, and many of them are open to learning and benefiting from paths other than their own and traditions other than their own. The number of people who call themselves spiritual independents or non-affiliated people, what has come to be called spiritual but not religious, or the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is larger than it's ever been and growing, especially among young people. And these are not necessarily people who have no spiritual lives or are, determined atheists or secularists. They're people who are pursuing a spiritual life, but they do it as independents. They recognize that everybody has his or her own path. And this is extremely Vedantic. This is extremely yogic. These are people who would not say, I'm a yogi, but they're yogis in the same way that Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman and people like that were yogis, because they're seeking to realize oneness in their lives. And they recognize that there are many paths to that spiritual experience, and they place their own inner spiritual experience and their own spiritual development above membership or loyalty to a particular religious tradition. They're yogis. If you say, oh, you're a yogi, they'll say, well, I can't even touch my knee, let alone, because they'll think of yoga in that way. But no, they're yogis in the deep sense. In many respects, they're more yogis than the people going to yoga classes to look better. And their attitude is extremely Vedantic. This is not a coincidence. It's directly attributable to the access we have had, especially in the last 50 years, but going back to the arrival of Swami Vivekananda, even prior to that, to the arrival of the better translations and books from India that people like Emerson and Thoreau read. The access to these teachings has transformed the spiritual landscape. And as far as I'm concerned, it's made that landscape far better than it was before, and that trend is likely to continue. I won't bore you with all the other data, but it's profound. And there are many factors responsible for this and many important people who contributed to it, but in that constellation of luminaries, Swami Vivekananda stands out as a sort of a light of lights. So I want to pay tribute to that and enumerate some of the ways his impact has settled into the soil, the spiritual soil of America. Some of these ways are more obvious than others. First, he was the first. And that's important. As you already heard, he came in 1893 and broke new ground in the spiritual landscape at that conference in Parliament of World's Religions in Chicago. How many of you have been to the site of that in Chicago? You should make a pilgrimage. It's now the Art Institute of Chicago, one of the great museums in America. You should go just to see the museum. But when you enter, to the left is the amphitheater where Vivekananda spoke, slightly refurbished. And then there's a plaque for him. The first time I went, I said to the security guard, can you point me to where Vivekananda spoke? And he looked at me like I was asking for an Indian restaurant. And he said, he didn't know what I meant. And I explained a little bit more, and he said, oh, is that the place where all the Indians go? It's become a bit of a pilgrimage place to see that. And so when you have an opportunity to go to Chicago, I recommend you go and pay homage to that place and the plaque. And when you leave the museum and exit onto Michigan Avenue, look up and you'll see a street sign that says Swami Vivekananda Way. It's an honorary street sign. Chicago does that in certain places. Take a picture of it, you know. But it was very important. And one thing you should know, the Parliament of World Religions had to do research on this. And, you know, we think of it as this great moment where all the different world's traditions came together in the spirit of ecumenical harmony and friendship. And it was. But it was also the hidden agenda of some of the organizers was, we'll have a few representatives from these heathen traditions. And it will be obvious at the end of the conference to all that our way, our Protestant way, is the culmination of religious history and the far superior one. This was clearly evident in the programming and the agenda. And mind you, at that time, this is 1893, very few Americans had met a Jew. Catholics were being discriminated against in major cities. People wouldn't employ a Catholic because they'd be beholden to the Pope and all this. It was a deeply Protestant country. And the Protestant ministers, who were the dominant voice at the Parliament, were going to demonstrate that. So it was a shock to the system when Swami Vivekananda stole the show. And that's part of the hidden story of the Parliament. And it reveals something about America right from the beginning, that there are two Americas, or two sets of Americans. And there's one group that doesn't like outsiders, or people who are other, people who are different. And they will do anything they can to denounce them, even commit violence and all that. And Vivekananda had to face that. There are other Americans who are open-minded and pragmatic and said, oh, this guy has something to teach. He has something to offer me. Let me go hear him. And the word got out, and more and more of those people came. And those people prevailed at the time. And as you may have noticed, those two sets of Americans still exist. And they're still at conflict. But he was the first. So mind you, here was this is less than 30 years after the Civil War. Diversity meant, you know, there were Methodists and Presbyterians. And here was a dark-skinned man representing what was, in most people's minds, a primitive culture and a primitive religion. And he prevailed, and he stole the show. This is extraordinary when you think of it. That's why I often, when I speak, I refer to Vivekananda as the Jackie Robinson of this story. And if you don't know what I mean by that, I'm very saddened. Google it. He had that kind of impact that broke stereotypes and broke prejudices and healed misconceptions that people had, understandably, about this foreign culture under the thumb of the British Empire, and, you know, the prevailing images people had of India and Indian history and traditions. So he broke those barriers. This is terribly important as a contribution, and it set the stage for further developments after he passed. The other thing that he had the courage and the wisdom to do was, you know, he only was here a few years, and then he tragically passed, you know, before he was 40. But he had the foresight to recognize that the voice of Vedanta, the voice of the spiritual heritage, could have an impact in America. People wanted it. People turned to it. And he knew that you had to create structures for that to endure and continue. And so he took steps to make sure that the framework and structure for that was in place. Training American devotees to carry on, creating at Bellarmut in India the structure to train swamis to be able to come here and represent the tradition. Leaving behind very important written works. Just the 4 thin volumes on the 4 yogas, if that was the only thing he had left behind by way of written words, it would have been a tremendously significant contribution, because those books were read by many, many people and had an important impact on a lot of people's lives. One, you may have heard of George Harrison. When George was a young seeker and went to India to study sitar with Ravi Shankar, he was a fallen Catholic. He had turned his back on the tradition of his birth. But he was a deep seeker, as many were in those days in the mid-60s. And he was given some books to read while he was in India, one of which was Raja Yoga, Vivekananda. And it's one of 2 books, the other being Autobiography of a Yogi, that he would speak about the rest of his life. And Raja Yoga was a book that turned him around and said, this changed the way I understood religion, and it turned him on a path of being a very dedicated and deep bhakta and yogi and meditator for the rest of his life. And it was because of that the Beatles, as a group, got interested in meditation and went to India, and that changed world history for reasons we can talk about separately, or you can read about in my book. So those kind of chains of influence we can attribute to Vivekananda's legacy. Just even small things like that. And of course he established the Vedanta Society, under whose auspices we're all here. And as anybody who's ever been involved in a spiritual organization knows, they're not easy to start, not easy to maintain, not easy to keep afloat. Yogananda called them hornets' nests. But they're necessary, and Vivekananda knew it. And so established the structures, and his successors maintained those structures. And so we have Vedanta societies functioning all these decades in America. And here we are, 12 decades after the very first Vedanta society under these auspices. And it's a tremendous tribute to him that they endure. And their presence has been a terribly important feature of the American landscape. Some of the people who found their way to Vedanta societies over the course of the decades in turn became transmitters of Vedantic knowledge into the West. And I don't just mean people like my illustrious comrades on stage, or the official teachers and ministers and swamis. I mean just ordinary devotees. And people who are not devotees, people who just would occasionally go to the centers, read the materials, and then share them with their friends. That's how teachings of value spread. And their presence, especially in the early part of the 20th century, when they were the only presence from India in America to speak of. And this business of starting an organization is very important, because there were other teachers from India who would come and go, yoga teachers, swamis, but we don't know about them. Swami Tirtha, for example, a very illustrious teacher from India who had a presence here in the Bay Area. No one knows about him because he did not leave behind an organization that endured, or books that endured, did not have the presence that Vivekananda did. And some of the people who over the course of decades found their way to these Vedanta societies and in turn became transmitters were important people. People who didn't just share information with their friends and family, but became famous and had voices that reached millions of people. And I feature some of those in American Veda because they were terribly important. These are people who absorbed the teachings through their mentorship with Swamis and integrated the knowledge into their own disciplines, into their own fields of expertise, and explicitly or implicitly broadcast the core teachings of Vedanta to the rest of the society, sometimes in very large numbers. So, for example, to cite the most important ones, in New York in the 1940s and 50s, Swami Nigamananda was running the Vedanta Society. You know him as the person who wrote the translation of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He was assisted in that project by a young scholar named Joseph Campbell, who became Joseph Campbell in later years, and one of the most prolific and important interpreters of the world's religions and the world's mythological stories, who reached millions and millions of people through his best-selling books and TV appearances and all that. He's absorbed the key teachings of Vedanta under the wing of Swami Nigamananda, and that informed all his work. You can see it in his work, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly. Similarly, in New York, during those same years, J.D. Salinger, the famous novelist, was a student of Swami Nigamananda. How many have read Salinger? How many have read something other than Catcher in the Rye? Good, so you know. The post-Catcher in the Rye books, Franny and Zooey and so on and so forth, some of the stories there imbued with Vedanta, imbued with the insights of the world's mystical traditions. And he was very explicit that his fiction was an attempt to show, to depict mostly young American seekers in New York City in the 1950s and 60s, trying to integrate a deep spiritual life with being in the world. He was struggling with it himself, and he depicted it in his characters, and it was his way of showing the value of Vedanta in real life. And those stories had a huge impact on people. Including me. I remember when I read them as a young seeker in the 60s, and I said, oh God, I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one going through this stuff and thinking about that. At around the same time, mid-20th century in St. Louis, under Swami Satyaprashananda, the great scholar Houston Smith was beginning his career and found his way to the Vedanta Society and mentored under his Swami and became the most illustrious scholar of religion in the second half of the 20th century. His textbooks, if you read his textbook, and if you're lucky enough to be in college and have it assigned to you, you got an understanding of the world's religions. His books are in the shop, by the way, as well as a biography of him by a friend of mine. And that was very different from the way religion was being taught and written about in those days. And that's because of his mentorship in St. Louis at the Vedanta Society. He was very explicit about that. Of course, most of you know him for his most famous work, the foreword to American Veda. I was honored that he wrote that, and when I interviewed him and I said, I want to explore the importance of Vedanta in your work, he was old and failing at that time, and he stood up erect in his chair and he said, "It was immense." and it was, and it had an enduring impact on millions of people. And in Los Angeles in those years, Gerald Hurd and Christopher Isherwood and Aldous Huxley were there studying with Swami Prabhavananda, and their impact was enormous because Isherwood was a famous novelist, and Huxley was a famous writer and philosopher, and their point of view, the way they saw the world, was now transformed into a very Vedantic one. Huxley went on to write The Perennial Philosophy, which informed a lot of people's spiritual lives, and other works. They helped create the Vedanta Press and created anthologies that Huxley wrote the introductions to. Prabhavananda and Isherwood collaborated on many works that were read widely. Their Gita in 1944, I think, was reviewed in the New York Times because of Isherwood. It was the first Gita I ever read. In the 60s, everybody was reading these books from the Vedanta Press. Vedanta for the modern man, Vedanta for the Western world. These anthologies written, contributed to by important scholars. They had a huge impact. When the counterculture happened and people like Alan Watts were popular, we needed reading material, and this was a large part of it. I still have some of the books I read in the late 60s, and I'm going to prove it. I brought with me the two thin ones. This is my copy of The Crest Jewel of Discrimination. You can see how old it is. Here's my How to Know God, the Yoga Aphorisms of Patanjali. 95 cents. $1.25. I still have them. They're all yellow and underlined. And I've moved about 100 times. These were terribly important. The Vedanta Press, the presence of the Vedanta Society. But now I want to turn to a more subtle impact that Swami Vivekananda had on the culture. And that is his impact on the other gurus and swamis and yogacharyas who came here after him. That parade of teachers from India that really picked up after the 60s when the immigration laws changed and the counterculture was demonstrating a deep desire to know more about Indian culture and Indian philosophy. Most of those teachers who came in the 60s and 70s and subsequently are better known than Vivekananda was, or is, because they stayed here longer. It was more recent in our history. It was a time of jet travel and mass communication, so they're very well, they became well known. But they all owed a debt to Swami Vivekananda because he set the template and was the inspiration for them in their coming here and in how they approached their work. And in many ways, they had an audience, an eager audience, because of Swami Vivekananda and his work, because of the books, because of the presence of the other swamis who succeeded him at the Vedanta Society, because of all the people, the Americans they met and taught, who then told their friends. That's how the impact lasts. So he essentially legitimized Indian spirituality and its core teachings, so that when the later gurus and swamis came, there was an audience for it. They did not have the same level of misunderstanding and the barriers of stereotypes, because Swami Vivekananda had paved the way, just as other African American baseball players didn't have to endure what Jackie Robinson did. They came from all their different lineages, and had their different orientations toward Vedanta and yoga and the Vedic heritage. But when they showed up, there of course was still resistance and still, that stereotypes, but not to the same degree. And they were not seen as religious relics. An Indian spiritual teaching wasn't just, some fanciful, exotic thing. No, people understood them to have something to offer in ways that, because of the stage had been set for them, that these were practical teachings. And Vivekananda showed that these core teachings of the Vedic heritage could be articulated in modern language and understood in a way that was compatible with reason and rational thinking and the pragmatic approach to evidence-based spirituality, not in conflict with science, not in conflict with the known facts of history, but compatible with them and supportive of them. And every guru who followed had the same, or presented the same orientation. And he had set the template for this. Whatever their particular orientation was, they had to adapt these eternal ideas and frame their teachings in a way similar to Vivekananda in adapting to modern language in practical terms. And at the same time, while adapting, preserving the integrity of the core teachings and not diluting them, not distorting them for the sake of reaching more people. And that delicate thing, the template was set for them by Vivekananda. And this doesn't mean they imitated him, but they all knew who he was. They all were inspired by him. And at the very least, stood as proud children of India in that same tradition of being emissaries to the West in the way that India has honored Vivekananda ever since. So when people like Swami Vishnudevananda was sent here by his guru Swami Shivananda, who certainly would have revered Vivekananda, he sent him here in the 1950s to teach that form of yoga. He knew he was representing something that the ground had been paved by Vivekananda. So did Swami Satchidananda, who established integral yoga here. In the 70s, I spent time with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi when he became world famous after the Beatles had made him the so-called Beatles guru, and he was teaching his form of meditation. And I watched him adapt the language of Vedanta to the language of modern science, and at the same time being very careful not to distort or disturb the heritage and the integrity of the tradition. I never heard him speak about Vivekananda, but that doesn't mean he didn't. But certainly he's a good example of somebody who knew what his debt was to Vivekananda, because his own guru was the Shankaracharya of the northern part of India. And they traced their heritage to Shankara. And I know historically that after that Shankaracharya passed, the man who would become known as Maharishi went to the south of India and went to places Vivekananda had been, including Kanyakumari. The famous statue of Vivekananda was not there yet, but the legacy was there. And when he was asked to come to the West, he knew, like the other gurus and the other swamis, that he was preceded by a great spiritual warrior before him. And he would have learned from that. Similarly, Srila Prabhupada, who brought the Hare Krishna Bhakti movement here to America, certainly knew his debt to Vivekananda because he was a child of Calcutta. He was a boy of 5 or 6 years old when Swami Vivekananda passed, and he grew up in the Calcutta. That was where the heritage of Sri Ramakrishna and the presence, the living presence of Holy Mother, and the legacy of Vivekananda was very alive and vivid. He would have absorbed that. And he went to he was a graduate of Scottish Church College, one of whose great alumni was the man who became Swami Vivekananda. So when he came, he knew. And similarly, probably the most famous and most influential of all the gurus to come here, Yogananda, because of his autobiography of a yogi and his teaching, he was here for 32 years of his life. And he too was formed in the Calcutta of that early part of the 20th century. I lead tours of India, and we go to Calcutta, we go to the Yogananda's family home, and his ashram, which is down the road from the Dakshineswar Kali temple. His home, where he spent his teenage years. He also went to Scottish Church College, so he was it was clear in my research on his life when I wrote his biography, the debt he owed to that tradition, to the Ramakrishna Vivekananda lineage is huge, and very clear and very vivid in his life. He was born the year Vivekananda came here in 1893, and his home in his teenage years, you can walk to the Vivekananda's family home where he grew up, which is now a museum. How many of you have been there? This is another pilgrimage for you all. And right downriver from Belur Mutt, the headquarters of the Ramakrishna mission, and across the river where the Dakshineswar Kali temple, where Ramakrishna's presence is still felt. Yogananda, as a teenager, was not only a distant relative of Sri Aurobindo, who owed a great debt to Vivekananda, and knew Tagore, who was a contemporary of Vivekananda, so he would have absorbed all this. That would have been his role model when his own guru told him to go to America. But prior to that, when he was a seeker, when he was a young sadhak in his teenage years, he had many mentors before he found his own guru. One of those mentors, probably the most important one, was somebody he called Master Mahasya. And he studied for a long time with him. He, at that time, was an educator who had a school a short walk from Yogananda's family home, and he would spend a lot of time with Master Mahasya. Do you know who Master Mahasya was? You know him as M, the person, the compiler of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He was a close disciple of Ramakrishna's, and he would take young teenage boy who became Yogananda to Dakshineswar, and they would spend a long time learning about Ramakrishna and meditating in the places Ramakrishna sat and made sacred. This was part of his early spiritual training, and he would spend long hours at the temple and later would bring his own students there. And so when he came here, when he was essentially had the calling to come to America and accomplish all he did, he was only 27, and it was 1920, so it was only 2 decades from the time Vivekananda made his impact on America. He would certainly have known that he had this illustrious predecessor, and it gave him more confidence and more courage, and as I said, a role model and a template to do what he subsequently did. So for all those reasons, and of course then he came to America first and spent 4 years in Boston, and it was only less than 20 years since Vivekananda himself spoke at Harvard, and so the legacy, the imprint of Vivekananda would have been very fresh in Yogananda's mind. So for all these reasons, the example he set, the template he created for the integration of India's spiritual wisdom to the West, his articulation of a modern Vedanta, of a practical Vedanta, as he put it, his writings, his leadership, the organization he established, all of this created a lasting footprint on the spiritual lives of America. You all know that. You have been the beneficiaries of it. But so have millions of people who don't know it. They just absorb ideas, whether it's from their psychologist or a professor, or reading Salinger, or reading Joseph Campbell, or listening to Oprah, or Deepak Chopra, or whoever it is. The spiritual essence of India's great wisdom, of the wisdom of the rishis, comes through, and it changes people. They become, in their own way, Vedantists and yogis, and they don't know where it comes from. And that's up to people like us to at least let them know. It doesn't matter. I mean, I think and I hope that when the complete history of this era of American spirituality is written, people will fully appreciate the impact that India has had on us, and the role, the vital role that Swami Vivekananda played. And of course, the irony of that is he wouldn't care. He wouldn't care if he was known or he was given credit. The impact is what mattered, and that impact is very real. But I think it is important for people like us to make that history known and make names like Vivekananda's known to people, because it's not only proper and it's not only giving India and its great representatives the dignity and the respect they deserve, but it helps to preserve the teachings if we acknowledge their sources and acknowledge their great representatives. So I hope all of you will take that to heart and not be shy about sharing all the benefits you have had, all the wisdom you have gained through this legacy, and share it with the rest of the world, especially in the times we're living in. Stop me. Don't get me started.